This is a CBC podcast.
Dansei, Anine, Bonjour, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. When I was just a wee dear child, I sat in a movie theater and saw the words "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away" scroll into a field of stars, and I was hooked. Star Wars is a beloved movie franchise that spans generations. Since the first film's release in 1977, it's become a worldwide pop culture phenomenon. With the Rise of Skywalker in theaters now, we're exploring the Star Wars universe with an Indigenous lens.
Got the idea to build a full-scale R2-D2. He painted it with traditional Hopi pottery designs and motifs.
Some of the languages that are spoken, for instance, the Ewok language it's taken from the tribe Miwok.
When Princess Leia walks into Jabba the Hutt's lair in Return of the Jedi, and she says, "Yate, yate," which is hello in Navajo.
What's this in Native American Baby Yoda thing that I'm seeing everywhere? And I'm like, wow, we're using this, our creativity in marrying it to pop culture to the point where editors at NBC in New York are seeing it.
The idea of this hokey religions with ancient weapons attempting to resist an overwhelming imperial force has a kind of natural resonance for Indigenous peoples.
Star Wars Resistance Reborn is a new novel and the prequel to the film in theaters now, The Rise of Skywalker. It tells the story of Poe Dameron as he rebuilds the Resistance under the guidance of General Leia, after they were defeated by the First Order in The Last Jedi. The book was written by Black and Okewenge author Rebecca Rowanhorse, who joins me from Santa Fe. Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you for having me. Glad to be back.
Now, first off, how did you get the offer to write this book for the Star Wars expanded universe?
I still am not sure how I got this offer. I think it started with me sort of joking around, pleading on social media for a Native author to write a Star Wars story. Any Native author, I didn't particularly mean me. The idea caught on with a number of other Star Wars authors. And I think the word just sort of got passed up the chain, and the editors reached out to my agent, and she's like, "Hey, you want to write a Star Wars?" And I was like, "Absolutely."
Oh, my gosh. Was that your reaction, or did you, run around screaming for a while?
No, I ran around screaming for a while. I tried to stay dignified here on the radio, but no, I completely freaked out. I think I closed the email, walked away, came back. I just really wasn't sure, is this a joke? Is this for real? It was awesome.
Now, are you a Star Wars fan yourself?
I am, yeah, absolutely. I was not sort of, a super crazy Star Wars fan before I started, but I grew up with the movies. It's always been a part of my life. My brother and I used to play with the action figures when we were kids. Actually, I would steal his action figures and create my own stories and adventures with them. And of course, I saw all the movies in the theater because I'm that old. And, so it was just always a part of my life. But what writing, I think, this novel did was let me rediscover a lot of the magic of Star Wars that I hadn't really, embraced, for years. So I got to discover the expanded universe and the novels and the games and all the, the comic books, everything that's going on beyond just the movies, I got to absorb. And it's really been amazing.
Yeah. Now, Resistance Reborn is the bridge between the film The Last Jedi, released in 2017, and The Rise of Skywalker, which is in theaters now. So can you tell us what happens in the book?
Oh, well, I'll try not to be spoilery, even though the movie has been out for a while. But basically the book, as you said in the intro, it picks up right after The Last Jedi. The Resistance has been decimated at the Battle of Crate. The only people left can fit on the Millennium Falcon, basically, and they have to rebuild. They have to find their way back from devastation. They've lost all their leadership. They've lost their entire fleet, and they're really adrift. So this story is about how they do that.
Was there a lot of pressure to write the prequel to the anticipated end of the Skywalker saga?
Yes.
Yes.
I think a lot of the pressure so the deadline was very tight. I had 4 months from contract to draft
Wow.
to write this novel. Yeah. So that is very fast if you're in the publishing world. And I put a lot of pressure on myself also, though, to get it right, because I was a fan and because I knew there were a lot of fans out there that are very invested in the franchise, but in the characters, too, So it was important to me to get Leia right and to get Poe right and to give people something of what they love. So, yeah, lots of pressure.
For sure, yeah. Now, in Resistance Reborn, you got to develop the character of Poe, as you said, he was a commander in the Resistance's Starfighter Corps. His first appearance in the film was The Force Awakens. And in your book, Poe helps rebuild the Resistance movement with the guidance from General Leia. What did you think about as you developed such important characters in the Star Wars universe?
So this really is a Poe book. So if you're looking for Rey or you're looking, for something a little more Jedi-esque, this book really focuses on Poe. And so my way in was Leia, actually. I was thinking of Leia and war, Star Wars. It's right there in the title, and what that must be like. And so her living through this generational war, a war that, took her parents, took her home planet. She has lost her brother and her husband and her son, in a way, to this war. And that sort of grief and burden that she must carry with her. And that really was my foray into understanding Star Wars. And from that, Poe as well. Because for Poe, if you remember in The Last Jedi, he led a mutiny. He got a lot of, I hope that's not spoilery. I think it's been long enough. But he got a lot of people killed on his watch, and it was his fault. And so I wanted him to really struggle with that guilt. I wanted to take that seriously. And we talk about things like redemption and atonement and penance in this book, and what that looks like, and how you make amends for the things that you've done wrong that have cost people their lives.
Yeah. Now, how did what you wrote in Resistance Reborn influence the new movie that we're seeing, Rise of Skywalker?
Oh, well, I would say that the movie takes precedence. It's probably the other way around. But J.J. Abrams did give me notes on my outline.
You got notes from J.J. Abrams? Holy smokes.
Did. One in particular that I wanted to do, and he's like, no, you can't do that. So that's pretty cool. But, my book really is there to fill in, I think, a lot of the blanks because a lot of time passes between the end of Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. And for people who are wondering, hey, where'd they go? What happened? What was the immediate aftermath of this devastating loss to the First Order? The book is there to sort of give you the backstory, to fill in some of the blanks.
Your book looks at rebuilding the Resistance, or the good guys, for those who are unfamiliar with the films. They're rebuilding to prepare to push back against the First Order, or the bad guys. And so we're seeing a little bit of a theme of colonialism here. As an Indigenous writer yourself, how do you bring that knowledge, your experience with colonialism into the story?
Yeah, I think I was joking with a friend of mine, and, he was like, well, if anyone knows anything about resistance, it's Indigenous people. And I was like, absolutely. And so one thing I did do is bring Native characters into Star Wars. I have one particular character who has a Pueblo name, and I really envisioned him as Pueblo. And so that was a lot of fun. So one of the things I like to do in my work is not so much talk back to colonialism as indigenize my work, so that the Indigenous story sort of stands on its own, so that we don't have to be in this constant conversation with the past. We can look towards the future. And so when you're setting a story, particularly in space, even if it is in a galaxy far, far away, you can look for ways to indigenize that too, things that resonate with readers, all readers, but Indigenous readers in particular.
Now, on the show, we're looking at why Indigenous people love Star Wars so much and are so connected and feel that connection with it. What is it about Star Wars, do you think, that you love so much?
Well, Star Wars pulls a lot of its influence from indigenous cultures. You have everything from Princess Leia's hairstyle, which is a Hopi hairstyle, to the Ewoks, who are their name and their location is influenced by the Miwok tribe of Northern California, to when Princess Leia walks into Jabba the Hutt's lair in Return of the Jedi, and she says, "Yate, yate," which is hello in Navajo. So we are all over the Star Wars universe. I think that that's part of it, that we see ourselves in it, and I think there's, the whole idea of this ragtag sort of group of scrappy heroes fighting it back against this empire is appealing. And often winning, which is also exciting, but, taking huge losses too. And, I think the spirit of it, that it's about, found family and kinship and forgiveness and all of those things, I think, resonate with an indigenous crowd. Plus, there's some very cool droids. And some just awesome settings and exciting adventures that I think are just as appealing.
Yeah, and you get to make this noise. Pew, pew, pew.
Exactly. Very important.
Well, Rebecca, may the force be with you.
Thank you.
Rebecca Roanhorse is an award-winning author based in Santa Fe. She wrote Star Wars: Resistance Reborn, which is the prequel to The Rise of Skywalker, in theaters now. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild, talking all about the indigenous origins of Star Wars on the show today. And sometimes we make up those origins along the way, like with Baby Yoda.
My name is Simon Moya Smith. I am an enrolled citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. I'm also a Chicano, and I'm a writer and journalist. The story that I wrote for NBC News out of New York was amazing that my editor, I believe, is Irish and Scottish, and she hit me up and asked me if I wanted to do a piece on what she referred to as, what's this Native American Baby Yoda thing that I'm seeing everywhere? And I'm like, wow, we're using this, our creativity in marrying it to pop culture to the point where editors at NBC in New York are seeing it. And that demonstrates the impact that we have as indigenous peoples when we collectively are creative. My absolute favorite, Baby Yoda, I think this wasn't even a meme, it was a video. It was of a Tribe Called Red when he's hitting the switch in the spaceship, and you can he's like turning the music turns on, and then of course the Mandalorian turns it off, and then just to test the boundaries just a little bit, Baby Yoda does it again. And again, that is representative of the curiosity of kids, but also it's emblematic and of the creativity of indigenous people today. You know what we should do? We should take that, put Tribe Called Red on it, and then blast it out there. And I think if we continue to share that, we will no longer go ignored, especially in mainstream and alternative media, because it's hilarious, but it also is representative of our creativity just as indigenous people.
Simon Moya Smith is an Oglala writer and the author of an article called "The Mandalorian May Never Reveal Baby Yoda's True Origins, but Native Americans Already Know." Later in the show, we visit with fellow Indigen nerd Sonia Ballantyne to explore why so many Indigenous people are connecting with little Baby Yoda. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. If you went to the movie theater over the holidays, you might have noticed that Star Wars is huge right now, with Rise of Skywalker expected to pull in about $1 billion in worldwide ticket sales so far. And many Indigenous fans of the franchise see a lot of parallels between Star Wars and the stories from their own communities. Darren Lonefight is a member of the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota. He's a cultural studies scholar who loves Star Wars so much it snuck into his writing. He joins me from Springfield, Massachusetts. Welcome, Darren.
Rosanna, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone for listening.
Well, thank you for being here.
You bet.
So, Darren, why do you and other Indigenous people love Star Wars so much? What's the connection there?
It's a big question. I mean, I was talking to my father about this actually, and he always likes to note that, you know, the idea of this like hokey religions with ancient weapons attempting to resist an overwhelming imperial force has a kind of natural resonance for Indigenous peoples and our history with colonialism. I think also, just like anyone else, I mean, it's a very kind of fun, neat story. It's got a really wide and expansive world that I think a lot of people feel like they can both take part of and help create.
I've heard that Star Wars has Indigenous origins, that George Lucas based the story off the writing of Joseph Campbell. Can you tell me about who that was and how his writing influenced the Star Wars universe?
So Joseph Campbell, I mean, maybe most famously through Star Wars, kind of forwarded this idea of the hero's journey, or a kind of deep structural mythology that is shared universally through and across all of humanity. He kind of takes this from Jung and Freud, and we're sort of getting that vectored through George Lucas putting it up on the film. But his book, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he elaborates on that, was read by George Lucas in college, and he loved it. And as he was drafting the Star Wars trilogy, he had not finished a final draft yet. He was having trouble kind of getting everything together and figuring out the direction that he wanted to take the movie, how he wanted to kind of structure the pace and so forth. And he returned to A Hero with a Thousand Faces right as he was kind of struggling with that broader planning part. And so he uses the tropes and the kind of structure that Joseph Campbell presents in his work to then structure the Star Wars universe and the Star Wars plot as well. And Joseph Campbell himself was, you know, by his own biography, obsessed with Native Americans and Native American culture from a very young age. As I recall, by the age of 10, he had read everything in his local library on Native Americans, and then began to sort of work through broader pieces, such as the reports of the Bureau of American Ethnology, which are these multi-volume collections of archival materials and so forth. So he had a really deep kind of obsession with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures. And then that leads to this broader work that he ends up doing, which he pursues some of these mythologies and cultural traditions and tries to extrapolate them, I guess, globally to these kind of various aspects or components that seem to resonate across a vast variety of different cultures around the world.
So in other words, Star Wars fans, you're welcome.
Yeah, well, and certainly, I mean, even some of the things, like if you think about the way that the Force is kind of articulated within the world of the film, there's a lot of resonance with this idea of something that sort of animates everything, but also connects everything together. And you get this kind of non-dualistic construction of good and bad, where both the dark side of the Force and the light side of the Force sort of contain each other in each other. And so there's never a sort of pure good or pure evil, but always they sort of move back and forth, and they can always be found in each other. And I think that resonates at least with our traditions as well as with other Indigenous traditions that I've sort of interacted with and chatted with people about.
Sure. This idea of balance and so on. But there's another aspect to the Star Wars universe that many people have pointed out, and that's the story of colonialism. So for people who've never thought about it that way, can you explain how this plays out?
Sure. Well, so I mean, you know, the Empire in the world of the films has a kind of familiar sense about them. I think that partially it was constructed around World War II. He also notes, George Lucas notes that Vietnam and the conflict in Vietnam also come up specifically with sort of how he constructed the Ewoks. So you're getting various aspects or historical events where imperial powers are sort of expanding, and you get this kind of expansion through violence and occupation. Also, the movie is often read as a kind of allegory of the American Revolution and the empire as a stand-in for the British Empire. And you'll note that a lot of at least in the original three, a lot of the quote-unquote bad guys all have British accents. And so the sparky, spunky rebellion group who was fighting against this large empire. But I think for an Indigenous viewer, it seems very obvious that there are a lot of parallels in terms of how not only in the world itself, I mean, it's constructed in places that have particular meaning for various Indigenous groups, specifically in the Southwest, I think, of the United States. But more broadly, just this kind of notion of the overwhelming odds of sort of banding together, finding alliances, creating an alliance, and sort of salvaging what you need to and what you can in order to resist something that seems completely unbeatable. Something like the Death Star, for instance, is, I think, a deeply resonant story, and it's the story of a lot of our people through time as they've resisted colonial forces through history since contact.
Do you think that non-Indigenous and Indigenous audience see that connection when they sit in the theaters? Like, do they realize they're the bad guys?
I don't know. Well, so I think, it's viewer to viewer. I actually think that's part of why you have so many Indigenous artists also playing with the iconography, because it's already kind of deeply entrenched into global media. I mean, most people will recognize the Star Wars helmet, for instance. And I think often the way in which a sort of standard Western viewer is going to position themselves is perhaps either through this idea of the British Empire and the overwhelming odds. There's still this idea of the kind of American revolutionaries as that scrappy rebellion. And so I think actually part of the power is that artists are able to take this thing that already has this deep penetration into pop culture. It's already something that people are aware of. It's a vast repository of symbols of meaning that are already in place within broader culture. And to kind of turn that on its head and say, the empire that's being constructed here is not the one that you're sort of historically imagining, but in fact one that's currently existing. And this fight and this resistance has a resonance for us right now, not 200 years ago, 300 years ago, but, an ongoing resistance. So I think that's kind of part of what a lot of visual artists and other artists are playing with or toying with as they engage with and sort of rework different aspects of the Star Wars universe.
I also want to ask you about Princess Leia. We've all have heard about her hairstyle, the iconic double side buns.
That's right.
And this has Indigenous origin. Tell me where this hairstyle comes from.
So it's a Hopi hairstyle. It was also worn by women during the Mexican Revolution. So it is kind of Hopi squash or Hopi squash whirl is often how it's considered or called. It's a very traditional Hopi hairstyle that wasn't the first time it sort of made its way into mainstream American culture. In the 1920s and 30s, it became briefly popular kind of with the Bohemian set as a way to kind of, much in the way that it often happens now. So like headdresses at Burning Man, as it turns out, have a very long kind of tradition in America. And so you had these Hopi whirl bun styles being worn by typically European women who were reaching out for a kind of ethnic difference that they could play with or sort of appropriate and put on as a means of distinguishing themselves from mainstream culture that they were pushing against.
So, Darren, keeping all of that in mind with the hairstyle and so on, would you say then that Princess Leia is in fact Indigenous?
I do like to argue that. I also like to argue that Harrison Ford's character Han Solo is MHA Nation. But Leia with her hairstyle, I think sort of asked that question. I mean, what does a Hopi princess or a Hopi leader in the future look like, and why wouldn't they look like Princess Leia? And I'm not the only one to sort of pick up on that. Visual artist Nicholas Galanin has also talked about this and made a photograph. Things are looking native and natives are looking white, and it shows a kind of split piece with one half of Leia's face and one half of a Hopi woman's face, and you can see the similarities. And then Stephen Paul Judd has this great one that says, my great-great-great-grandmother was a Hopi princess. And it's where Leia's holding a blaster, kind of facing to the right, and he's kind of inserted into the photo 3 or 4 Hopi women who sort of have her back and are looking around her shoulders at the same direction that she's pointing. And it kind of draws this line and says there's no reason not to, we've been doing this for a long time, but there's no reason for us not to interpret her as an Indigenous person in the future. She's doing all the same stuff that you'd think that we'd be doing in that kind of environment. And she also sort of has to go through the profound experience of watching her home be destroyed and then picking up and moving on and continuing to survive and to endure and to continue to resist. And I think that is a really powerful statement. And if there was ever a reason to think she might be Indigenous, that would probably be it.
Are there other Indigenous influences that you have noticed in the films?
Well, so some of the languages that are spoken, for instance, the Ewok language it's taken from the tribe Miwok, the Miwok tribe in California, which is where George Lucas's home.
What?
As well as the headquarters. That's all in Miwok territory. So the name itself, Ewok, is taken from the Miwok.
Yeah. And
they originally began using recordings and sort of archival material of non-specified Indigenous languages, but it seems as though they had some trouble sort of getting that to work out. So they ended up ending up with a Mongolic linguistic form of the Kalmyk people. So it's a kind of a kludge of kind of an Indigenous language start. So you get some shapes and sounds there, and then finally built up with more from the Mongolic linguistic form. And then, of course, as a whole, it doesn't have a particular meaning in any Indigenous or non-Indigenous language per se, but its kind of inspiration comes from there.
Wow, that's fascinating. Many Indigenous artists, as you mentioned, are inspired by Star Wars, and in turn, they indigenize the film through their artwork. I'm going to be talking to an artist a little later on the show, but why do you think they're drawing inspiration from Star Wars so much in their visual art?
It's the million-dollar question, I think. But, like I said, I think there's something of resonance in terms of just how the broader film is structured around a small group of people coming together against an overwhelming force. I think that does speak to Indigenous communities. I think some of the worldview and the cosmology of the film, kind of going back to the Force here, is also a really important aspect of why it resonates. there's a kind of interesting parallel, I think, or at least an interesting way of thinking about it that has to do with the kind of temporality of the film itself. It's very common to kind of lock Native Americans representationally in the past. So when we see ourselves on screen, we see ourselves in books, it's often either kind of in the past tense or a reference to the kind of the last of. And this film kind of manages to allow you to do both because, of course, it is a historical film. I mean, it's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And so it has this kind of odd temporal register that is both backwards looking and that it says that it's, a historical document, but it's also, of course, very future looking in terms of its, composition and spaceflight and intergalactic travel and so forth. And I think that's really well emblematized by the lightsaber, which is, of course, the laser and the sword. I mean, if there wasn't a sort of more obvious juxtaposition of the future and the past, I don't know what there would be. But that seems to be kind of, I think, a valuable tool, this way to kind of play with time and think about what and where Native people can kind of come into the film.
Darren, may the force be with you.
Oh, and with you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Darren Lonefight is a cultural studies scholar based in Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm sure you recognize that sound. But this Hopi R2 looks a little different from R2-D2 that you know. You can see a picture of him on our site at cbc.ca/unreserved. A little later on in the show, how Indigenous artists are reimagining Star Wars and its droids. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Since the release of the new Star Wars series, The Mandalorian, Twitter has been abuzz with memes of Baby Yoda. And as soon as Indigenous people saw that little guy, many were quick to claim him as one of our own. And today, in a special investigative segment on Unreserved, we're going to get to the bottom of it. Sonia Ballantyne, our favorite Indigenerd, is standing by, and she's a huge fan of all things Star Wars. Welcome back, my friend.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being like pretty much the person who knows everything. Certainly makes our job easier.
Oh, Indigenous, yeah.
So what do you remember thinking the first time you saw little Baby Yoda?
I thought he was adorable. Like, I love the little brown eyes, the big ears, the oversized jacket. That was my favorite thing about him. He reminded me of my little sister, actually. So, because she used to wear an oversized jacket. She didn't have as big ears, but her eyes were just as big.
And now we get to the crux of this investigation, Sonia. Why is Baby Yoda Indigenous?
I think it has to do with how easily they are treated and taken in as a loved one, and how they're allowed to just wander around and get into trouble. Like, they're such a troublesome little thing, and everybody loves them for that. And it just makes your heart melt. When we meet Baby Yoda, we don't know anything about their background. We just know this guy wants to kill it. And that's all there is to know about him for a while, and that he likes to get into trouble. He likes to eat frogs. He likes to eat bone broth, which was the part, which is the part that I thought made him native, was when he was eating all this weird food. Like, you see him eat, like, if he started eating fish heads or like fish broth or something, I would be like, okay,
some
he's
muskrat
native.
in there.
But I just love the fact that he might be a little bit poverty stricken too, because like you don't ever see rich kids wearing big oversized clothing. You only see kids who will have to grow into their clothes. And the fact that he has to grow into his robe is something a lot of us can connect to. Like, it's why my parents dressed us in bigger clothes, is because we have to grow into them so we don't have to buy so much. And so it's like the little things that make him Indigenous to us.
Now, there's nothing in the storyline directly to suggest that Baby Yoda is Indigenous. There's been some nods to Indigenous culture, of course, in the Star Wars universe, but Yoda was never really part of that. So why was this little guy embraced so fully by Indigenous peoples?
Native people have taken to him, I think, just because he's so cute. Well, firstly and foremost, like, we're cute people as a whole. So I think also we've taken to him because of the lack of his backstory so far. And in that lack of backstory, you can put anything there. And I think that him being an orphan too, and finding a found family, is also a big part of Indigenous culture in terms of how we're raised by so many different people. Even if we have our parents with us, we're raised by grandparents, by aunties, by uncles. And I think we've latched onto that just because of how important it is to have such a large family. Because I just love how easily everybody falls in love with this character in the show. Even the ones who try to hurt him end up liking him a lot.
Now, we've seen a huge amount of all social media. You turn it on and you'll see Baby Yoda everywhere. In Indigenous art, there's medallions, there's earrings. I even saw one that was like the caribou tufting.
Oh, yeah, beautiful. It was really cute.
What are some of the standouts for you that you've seen?
The one of Baby Yoda in the moss bag has been a favorite of mine. Either when he's photoshopped into the back of someone at a powwow wearing a moss bag and he's in it, or beaded ones I've seen. There's a person on Twitter I won't name because I don't want Disney to go after them, but they have like stickers and decals you can put on your jacket. And I actually said on Twitter that all of Native Indian country should put that on the backs of our jackets so we look like a gang of some kind. So, but I just like, too, that how we've embraced that character, because, like, so much of our stories are about the past. We've latched onto this such a cute character. And I think it sadly has to do a lot with the lack of Indigenous representation for us. And also the fact that people of color tend to play aliens a lot of the time in movies like Marvel and Star Wars. But I like the little innocent times we adopt someone like that.
Now, as I mentioned, you're seeing a lot of this on Twitter, social media, Instagram, all of this stuff. Would this sort of reaction to the Star Wars universe, Baby Yoda, could it have happened before social media became so big a part of our lives?
Probably not, because as I tell a lot of my friends who on Native Twitter, who I've started calling Red Squadron, named after Luke Skywalker's fleet of X-Wing fighters, there was a lot of us that thought we were the only Native people that liked Star Wars. And so having Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, having those outlets connects us to each other, so we don't feel so alone. And like, because it's such a lonely feeling to be the only person on your res who is excited for Phantom Menace and no one understanding why. Well, I guess now I understand why, but having friends like Native Twitter who I've grown close to, and like from all parts of Indian country, from Australia, from Japan, having these Indigenous people come together as nerds through social media and realizing how important this universe has been to our lives is such a cool thing. Like, I know social media can be really negative sometimes, really horrible, like a really terrible place. Like, I had to shut off my Facebook messaging for a while because of some comments I was receiving. But Twitter on the whole has been so cool to me in that I have met very amazing people who have made me feel less alone, have made me feel like I belong. I can post like, did anybody watch episode 4 of The Mandalorian? And everybody's like, yes, queen, yeah, sort of thing. And so it's just fun to be able to talk to people and have them understand, because you read and see Star Wars differently as a person of color. Like, you notice things like, oh, why couldn't they have Rose Tico do more? Why couldn't they have Finn do more? That sort of thing. Finn and Rose being people of color. And it's such a cool thing because these characters feel like they belong to us and we want to see them succeed.
And finally, we've seen many people claim Baby Yoda is from their nation. This is a big moment. How is Baby Yoda Swampy Cree?
They're Swampy Cree because the bone broth was a big one.
Check.
Wearing the oversized jacket. The big one is probably annoying Mando by pressing the buttons on the ship when he knows he shouldn't, or sneaking off the ship when he's told he shouldn't, because I've done that a lot. So I see a lot of myself in Baby Yoda escaping the ship when his dad tells him not to, because I did that.
The ship being your community.
Yeah, and my house.
And your house, and wherever. The car. I'm out of here. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Sonia Ballantyne is a writer and filmmaker living here in Winnipeg. To see some Baby Yoda memes and artwork, visit our website at cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. A new exhibit at the Museum of Northern Arizona is a celebration of all things Star Wars, but with an Indigenous twist. The Force is with our people, features artwork from more than 20 different contemporary Native American artists and includes paintings, jewelry, pottery, and even cosplay costumes. Curator Tony Thibodeau joins me from Flagstaff, Arizona. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So tell me, what inspired you to launch this exhibit?
Well, the idea for the exhibit really came about 3 years ago. Back in 2016, I attended the first Indigenous Comic-Con in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This was a comic book convention started by Dr. Lee Francis, who's from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico. And he started the Indigenous Comic-Con as a way to showcase Native comic book creators, video game designers, graphic artists. And I attended that and couldn't help but notice the sort of overwhelming presence of Star Wars cosplay, Star Wars fan art, artists who were incorporating their own traditional art traditions with Star Wars at that first con. And then I returned in 2017. It had grown, probably tripled in size at that point. And that's when I first got the idea, working at a museum here in northern Arizona, got the idea that this could potentially be an interesting exhibit. The following year, I guess it would have been last year, 2018, I went to the con again, prepared with the exhibit in mind, and did interviews with about 8 different artists at that con to really try to dig into this question of what is it about Star Wars that motivates some of these Native artists to incorporate Star Wars imagery, Star Wars characters into their artwork.
Can you tell me what some of your favorite pieces are in the exhibit?
Oh, dear. That's almost like choosing your favorite child, right? And I don't like to play favorites, but there are a few that that really stand out to me. One piece in particular is, we call it Hopi R2. It's a full-scale R2-D2 unit that was built by a local electronics engineer here in Flagstaff. He got the idea to build a full-scale R2-D2, and then through the course of that process, brought in a local Hopi artist here in Flagstaff, Dwayne Koyuena. And Dwayne, he painted it with traditional Hopi pottery designs and motifs. So that's a really incredible piece because it's a fully functioning R2-D2. It moves and it talks and it makes noises, and I love watching kids interacting with this robot, which is controlled remotely, but a lot of kids react to it as if it was a living thing. Some of the pieces by Ryan Singer, who is a Navajo artist out of Albuquerque. Some of his pieces really sort of envision the Navajo Nation and landscapes on the Navajo Nation, sort of reimagine them as a parallel universe where Navajo people live side by side with Star Wars characters. What's striking, I think, about some of these pieces is that there's nothing jarring about it. It doesn't look like those characters are out of place. It looks like they belong there. And I think part of that has to do with some of the similarities. Ryan actually, told me that's kind of what inspired him to do these pieces. Is being a kid, he grew up in Tuba City, and he remembers going and visiting his grandmother's house and playing in the backyard with his Star Wars toys, and then looking out, over the landscape of the Navajo Nation, which is, of course, mesas and big, beautiful landscapes. And that, struck him as being very similar to some of the landscapes that he saw in those first Star Wars films, what Lucas intended as Tatooine, which, of course, was filmed, I believe, in Tunisia, but had a lot of similarities to some of the landscapes in the Southwest.
Fascinating. So with the new movie out and the new TV show on Disney Plus,
Sure.
There's definitely a lot of excitement around Star Wars. What's the response been to your exhibit?
It's been incredible. Part of it I had sort of anticipated since I had this idea for the exhibit 3 years ago. I knew at the time that the next Star Wars film was going to be released in December 2020. But I think maybe even more so, the new TV series The Mandalorian and the incredible response that the Baby Yoda character has gotten from people has really also drawn a lot of attention to the exhibit.
For sure. He's one of us,
Indeed. And actually, We've been very cognizant of the response from Native communities, from Native artists to Baby Yoda, and though we did not include any pieces in the exhibit because it didn't exist at the time that we were developing the exhibit, we actually have two pieces that we're going to add to the exhibit. Typically, museums don't usually add pieces to their exhibit once it's opened, but it is so timely. I think we have a piece by Dwayne and a piece by Ryan Singer that we're going to be installing in the exhibit to try to really draw attention to how Native artists and Native communities have really embraced this Baby Yoda character.
Very cool. Why do you think so many Indigenous artists have taken inspiration from Star Wars?
That's actually really sort of the goal of the exhibit, and the big question that we really tried to explore with the exhibit was, why Star Wars? So there's interpretation in the exhibit from me as the curator, but I think the bulk of the interpretation in the exhibit comes from the voices of these individual artists. For artists like Ryan Singer, it was something as simple as the similarities in landscapes. But another theme that a lot of artists really touched on was this idea of balance, and the idea of the balance in the Force, the balance between the light side and the dark side, and how that resonates with them with a lot of their own teachings from their own Native traditions, this idea of living in balance and living a life out of balance has parallels in a lot of different Native stories and Native oral traditions. One of the other things I think is relatively obvious is this theme that runs throughout the entire Star Wars narrative of resistance to imperialism. You just have to look at North American history and history between indigenous nations and the federal government. Those relationships, I think, really make the idea of resisting has a lot to do with it.
For sure. And of course, we all just secretly want lightsabers.
Exactly. Just because they're so cool.
They are cool. Well, thank you for your time today, Tony.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Tony Thibodeau is a curator and ethnographer from the Museum of Northern Arizona. He helped put together The Force is With Our People, an exhibit that celebrates Indigenous Star Wars-inspired art. The exhibit runs through May 2020. That's the sound of Hopi R2, who you can see roaming around the exhibit at the Museum of Northern Arizona. The droid was constructed by Joe Mastriani and was painted by Hopi Tewa artist Dwayne Koyawina. He joins me from Flagstaff, Arizona. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
So describe to me what Hopi R2 looks like.
Hopi R2 is a droid that was constructed by Joe Mastriani, engineer. And we were trying to come up with a design of how to paint him. We obviously didn't want just the basic R2 look with the blue and the white. So when he brought the dome out of his back room, he wanted to show me the dome, and he was carrying it like a pot. And I was thinking in my head right then and there, I was like, oh man, this will look really neat, like Hopi clay pottery. And some of the Hopi clay pottery that is out here also has burn marks for when they fire them. So it's like a tan with a little pinkish burn mark. So I painted the base like that, and then over the top also created with a bunch of Hopi pottery design.
And so before joining the project, did you feel a connection to the original R2-D2?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, growing up with Star Wars, I definitely loved the droids. The way I feel like we connect with the R2, Hopi R2 in the exhibit, the droids in the Star Wars that I see for myself have always been like some kind of support, or they're always trying to assist and help you get through certain things, however they're programmed. In relation to Hopi culture, there are definitely those supports, people that do try to encourage you and help you get through those locked doors or help you with information that you may need to pursue a good life. So that's the big connection in how I created that for the Hopi R2.
So sort of like aunties and uncles in our communities, right?
Definitely.
Thank you. So I hear that Hopi R2 is actually a working droid and he can be controlled by remote control. How do people react when they see him in person?
A lot of people in the exhibit, if Joe or I aren't there, the R2 kind of just stands as a statue, and it beeps on auto. It makes its noises on auto. But if I'm there, I try to sneak in sometimes and get the controls. It has his own little Wi-Fi and start moving his head around. And then I'll push on the app that's on our phone, start opening lids on his head and making different sounds and kind of move him around. And people like kind of freak out. They're like, oh my God, it does more than just stand here. A lot of people have told me that they thought it was just, a statue. It didn't do any of what they've seen. So a lot of people are really fascinated by how much it does.
Aw, I want one. So in addition to helping create Hopi R2, you've also contributed other artwork to the exhibit. How has Star Wars appeared in your artwork? For
me, as I started growing with Star Wars, started as a kid and then started developing and understanding the direction of Star Wars, of the dark side and the Force. I definitely went through my own personal life tribulations and recognized that as, living in the dark side. But now that, things are a lot different and my life is on a good direction, I feel like I'm kind of like living on the other side of the Force. But as an artist, I have created some pieces incorporating Star Wars and recognizing that whole good life and the dark side. But also in further creation and learning my culture more, my Hopi culture, and identifying also that Hopi, we strive for that good life, that good mind, that good heart in everything we do. That's our strive. But of course, also recognizing that there are those distractions in life and things that are going to try to knock you off balance. So today with my artwork, I do basically recognize that and incorporate some Star Wars with my Hopi culture.
Could you describe one of your pieces?
So we do have what we call katsinas, which are our gods, our spiritual deities that we pray to. They basically represent a lot of different aspects, nature, stars, insects, all kinds of different things, animals. There are deities that serve as like guards and protectors. I did a watercolor with one of these katsinas in it with kind of like a galaxy looking, like with stars, and I put the Death Star in there, and then I put some of the walkers in there. I put an X-Wing fighter with I think a Millennium Falcon's in there as well. But basically showing that the katsina that represents stars is kind of in this style of Star Wars, serving as a protector and a guard for basically like good life.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Thanks for your time today, Dwayne.
Yeah, thank you.
Dwayne Koyawina is a Hopi Tewa artist from Flagstaff, Arizona. He helped create Hopi R2, the star of the Force is With Our People exhibit at the Museum of Northern Arizona. The exhibit runs through May 2020. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.